In 1980s Britain, the Anti-Apartheid Movement drew nationwide support. Its mission? To end South Africa's racist apartheid system. And as violence increased in South African townships, support for anti-apartheid grew.
And so every night in 1985 on British telly, there were pictures of South African troops going into the townships and opening fire on people.
In this episode, veteran campaigners remember the boycotts and rallies that helped end apartheid.
Well, it wasn't a conscious decision. It was something that I was born into because my parents left South Africa as political exiles. Although at the time, my mother didn't know she was going into political exile. She had left in 1965 with my disabled brother, thinking that she could return. But my father, who'd been very active in the struggle against South apartheid, he had been imprisoned and tortured, and his comrades thought he may be under pressure to turn state witness. And he didn't, and he had no intention of, but they weren't to know that. And so word got out to my mum that she shouldn't try to come back. And so my sisters were smuggled out the country, my father fled, and I was born the following year in London. So it's kind of all I knew, really, apartheid and its impact from a very early age.
Christabel, you were involved in the anti-apartheid movement for a long time, but it really took off in the mid-80s. How did that happen?
Well, I was first involved in the protest against the cricket and rugby tours in 1969. But really, for a long time, the anti-apartheid movement was just run by a small group of very determined people, some of them South African exiles. And it was only really in the 80s that it took off in a big way among masses of people here in Britain. And I think it was largely in response to what was going on in South Africa, because for a long time the apartheid government had been very successful in shutting down anti-apartheid protests in South Africa. There were the 1976 Soweto student uprisings, but that was crushed. But in the early and mid-80s, there was an eruption in the townships because more and more people were coming to work in the townships and there wasn't decent housing. Wages were very, very breadline. And also there was the formation of the United Democratic Front. The presidents of that were former ANC people. And so every night in 1985 on British telly, there were pictures of South African troops going into the townships and opening fire on people. So that was a terrific kind of encouragement to British people to do something about it. And the anti-apartheid movement was there, organised, ready to take advantage of that. There was also the question of Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, was implacably opposed to sanctions in everything the anti-apartheid movement stood for. But although she won 3 elections in a row, she was a hugely divisive figure. And the anti-apartheid movement kind of became the international wing of the anti-Thatcher protest. And so there was a huge spread of people who were involved in other issues like the miners' strike, who also started supporting the anti-apartheid movement.
That's interesting because I joined the anti-apartheid movement in the mid-80s, about 1986, 87. And I didn't necessarily know how I had become activated. I was aware of apartheid. I had gone to university in Nigeria where we had South African students and Zimbabwean students exiled with us in university, who meant some of whom I was really good friends with. And I'd been conscious that apartheid was something that was unacceptable. It was viscerally a problem for me. And so I joined the anti-apartheid movement. But from what you've said, I was probably stimulated by what I was seeing on television and so on at the time. There was a huge attention in the media about all sorts of things. So I find it quite interesting about, well, why anti-apartheid? Why, of all the things that were happening in the world, what was it that actually made the anti-apartheid movement take off in the way that it did?
I think there was a kind of evolution, and just in summary, when Mandela and his comrades went into jail for life in the early 60s, quite a lot of the liberation movement had either been incarcerated themselves, not just those particular Rivonia trialists. They'd gone into exile or they'd been killed. And then the period of time that Christabel's talking about in sort of the 70s to the 80s, when it really, that resurgence of activism kind of followed through the whole Black consciousness movement, Steve Biko, the Soweto uprising. So there'd been a lull. Of course, it was still wrong and it was going on, and the arms of the apartheid state were terrible. But in terms of what the campaign outside could do and galvanise public opinion to change things, I think with the media coverage that Christabel's referring to, those were the ways that we could look at how, my goodness, this system is actually attacking children. It's shooting children. We'd already had Sharpeville in the early 60s, but people hadn't seen that as widely. And so I think all those things you're talking about, whether it was against the bomb, against Thatcher, and all her policies that were really impacting education here, the rights of children, the rights of women, that found a focus because South Africa represented all of those sorts of oppressions. Domestic women, so domestic servants were women who were oppressed in 3 different types of ways. There were all sorts of children, education, the miners' strike. There were miners being oppressed in South Africa. The miners were on a campaign here. And I think it offered an opportunity for different groups to come together, and especially within the trade union movement in support of people under South Africa's regime.
The anti-apartheid movement was also very good on its marketing. It's produced what we called merchandise, which was badges, T-shirts, and then music. There was a huge kind of eruption of anti-apartheid songs and music. This culminated in 1988 in the concert asking for the freedom of Nelson Mandela. But it had been going on for a long time, smaller concerts, and Free Nelson Mandela and Jerry Dammers, the Biko song. And so that created a new mass audience, I think.
I was a local anti-apartheid activist in Southwark, and I was co-chair of the Southwark Anti-Apartheid Group. And I remember this arrangement whereby we, in a sense, took guidance from the central anti-apartheid movement across the country. So there were loads and loads of little anti-apartheid groups all over the place that were doing the same thing on different days on the same issues. And with hindsight, that feels to me like a massive systematic way of organising ordinary grassroots people to give change. And I remember lots of what I would describe as innovative campaigns that we did, which we did as a group. So I don't know whether Nadia, you or Christabel remember any of those kind of organised and coordinated but different local efforts.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was born in West London, so my parents, along with Christabel and other people in that area who have remained activists in all sorts of ways, were very involved, and the whole kind of movement was very linked with all sorts of other struggles in that area. When they moved to North London, we were in the Barnet Anti-Apartheid Group. And it's interesting what you say about people coming together, because within that group, there were all sorts of people involved in churches, people in the Labour Party, teachers, all sorts of people, and exiles. There were quite a lot of exiles in North London, as it turned out. So I think that finding people along different areas of London that were involved, whether it was in schools, trade unions, you're absolutely right. The movement was saying to people, can you go and boycott Tesco's or wherever on a Saturday morning? Christabel was very involved with the Anti-Apartheid News editor. We would go out and sell that. On the weekend, I'd go with my dad and my sisters, and other people were doing it in their parts of the country. So it really did have a very kind of organic, but in some ways unified form of action, because it was unique to the location, but everybody was. You're right. Whether it was boycotting, picketing outside Shell, people were organising those in quite a kind of strategic way, I think.
Yes, and I remember, Christabel, you talked about the merchandise, which can seem trivial, but actually we had the Anti-Apartheid News, which was serious, and we had our badges and other mugs and T-shirts and so on to sell on our stalls. So while we're getting people to sign petitions and so on, we actually had stuff to engage the public with. And you were more centrally, you were also local at the time, Christabel, weren't you, as well as operating you worked at different levels, I guess.
Yes, I was in Notting Hill, and for while I was secretary of the Notting Hill Anti-Apartheid Group, which was a good place to be. But I think the boycott was very important because it was something, as you were saying, that everybody could do. You could not buy a South African apple and not, say anything, but just do it. But also, as a local group, you could go and stand outside your local Sainsbury or Tesco every Saturday morning or once a month, as we did in Notting Hill. And also the campaign against Barclays Bank was the same, because every high street had a Barclays Bank. And we turned up outside Barclays Banks, and the Anti-Apartheid Movement had frequent Barclays Days of Action. And students, of course, boycotted Barclays and stopped Barclays operating at student fresh affairs, and Barclays wanted student accounts. So the Anti-Apartheid Movement provided very straightforward things that everyone could do, and that they could do either on their own or they could do in groups, or other organisations could do. Camden Council, for example, withdrew its account from Barclays Bank. It was kind of focused in a very positive way.
We'll come back to Barclays as a victory. I think we should. But I remember, Nadia, you mentioned the Shell. So we had a Shell garage on Walworth Road. It's still there, actually. And we had the most beautiful poster that we created. So it was great fun for artists of all sorts. So there were the singers and songwriters. But we had this amazing, colourful poster that mixed up the colours of Shell plus the colours of anti-apartheid and so on. And it said, Shell fuels apartheid, boycott Shell. And we would stand outside there. So we had something every week, and it would change. We'd sometimes stand outside the local supermarket, sometimes outside the Shell garage, sometimes outside Barclays. It was a different focus, but we were sort of active every week, and it was quite a big part of our social life. The other thing I remember, and I don't know if either of you were involved with the Shell AGMs, going to the Shell annual general meetings, because I remember I bought one share in the Shell. I don't know, did either of you have a Shell share?
I didn't actually have a share, no, but we did go outside Shell House and pick it.
No, but in a way we pioneered that, I think, with Barclays. Much earlier in the 70s, we went to the Barclays AGM in 1972, and they just weren't expecting it. And we more or less broke it up by asking questions, and the chair just didn't know what to do.
That's exactly what we did with the Shell AGMs. And that was one of the highlights of my life, actually, to go to those AGMs, eat the canapes and drink the champagne at the beginning, and then disrupt the whole meeting by asking questions, then standing up and chanting. And it was just sweetened by the fact of having eaten the canapes and drank the champagne, and all these people that had come from all over the country for this AGM. And we did that every year for quite a while. One thing would be good to talk about then, now back to the victories. What were the things the successes really in the 80s?
Well, a lot of companies withdrew from South Africa in the 80s, and of course it was partly because of what was going on in South Africa and the unrest and the state of the South African economy, but it was also the reputational damage, especially with Barclays, I think. Barclays pulled out in 1986. So that was a huge victory. The other victory, of course, was the sports boycott, that after that was dated from the early 70s, that every major sporting federation had expelled South Africa, and there were occasional tours, rogue tours like the Gatting tour, where the cricketers in the late 80s, where the cricketers were being paid handsomely to go. And that was seen as a very unpopular thing to do, and the Gatting tour, cricket tour, was a disaster.
People had been doing these things for a long time, calling for sports boycotts, boycotting goods. And it just over time became a bigger thing. And with Barclays, I think it was a particularly powerful boycott, because students involved in the NUS were getting involved in their campuses, and they were becoming conscious. And often people would say, well, what can one person do? I'd have conversations with people there, well, what's the point? I'm only one person. And if I don't buy South African goods, then it's going to affect the black people. And those conversations were suddenly translating into results, because enough students were boycotting. And I think people started seeing on a really huge scale the impact of individuals coming together collectively. And that in itself was a victory, just in terms of mobilisation and sort of encouragement to people, I think.
Yes, I think the collective action can't be underestimated, really, at the time. And what I find quite interesting as well is that it was a collective action at a time when there was no technology. So there was, I think, how on earth did we manage when there were no mobile phones, for example? There was no internet. How did we manage that, to have a movement across the whole country with no technology
I think it was simpler.
Lela, don't you remember how we turned out outside tube stations on high streets with those thousands of leaflets, which now we have an archive like movements now won't have. We had posters, we went fly posting, we were stopped by the police when we went fly posting, but we gave out those leaflets.
Yeah, that was...
We covered sometimes like every tube station in London. We were supposed to be leafleting outside.
Nadia, what was your memory?
Well, I think the same as Christabel. You talked about the limitations of not having the technology we have now. You would have to say, will you be home at 6 o'clock? I might phone you. I might drop some leaflets off. I'll meet you. But people were really motivated to get involved. And then I think in some ways were really relied upon. We would have local branch meetings. There were, of course, AGMs. There was all sorts of opportunities for people to get involved and feel that they were part of what the campaign was how it was going to be shaped. So I think it was an incredibly invigorating time in terms of activism, and it was from children right up to elders, and people could do what they felt comfortable with. I know in Barnet Anti-Apartheid, the first sponsored walk I went on, I was 7, but I was one of the youngest. But there were people that were really quite elderly, well, at least they seemed to me as 7. They were doing what they could. It wasn't particularly strenuous, but it was something local. It got people talking. And then, of course, there were the huge demos in London, which involved a lot of planning and stewarding and all of those things. But I just think what was wonderful is it was lots and lots of people in lots of branches across the country, and then these really big moments where people would come together.
Speaking of technology, one of the things that I remember, and I don't know if either of you had the same, we used to have these phone trees. Did you have a phone tree? And I found it not that long ago, a phone tree, and it was this list of names and landline numbers. The way it would work is that if something happened in South Africa, which there was a call to action about, and that could be to do with stop an execution, calling for a particular law not to go through, whatever it was, and there'll be an urgent action, and somebody from our local group would be called by, say, the National Office of the Anti-Apartheid Movement, and then we would cascade this information through the phone tree. So for me, I would phone Christabel would phone Nadia, and so on. And if the person you were supposed to call wasn't there, you then phone the next person along, and so on, so that the tree would keep going. And I look at that now, and I think you'd have just had a WhatsApp group or something. But there we were, one phone call after another, and it actually worked. So if we were doing that kind of action and got the phone tree, triggered the tree, we would get loads of people out from across, for us, Southwark, to turn up either at Trafalgar Square or somewhere locally or whatever. And I think in some ways made it stronger as activism. I think that kind of activism is much more involving than sending a tweet.
I think I agree totally, because we feel that we've got all these means of communication, which we do now, but the urgency and the need to kind of just cut through everything and get on with it and be out there and be committed, it was far simpler. And then with the merchandise, as Christabel has mentioned, all those things, wearing badges, having the leaflets, wearing the T-shirts, you were the person. You weren't, we didn't have any social media platforms. We were the social media.
It's true.
And we had to just go out there with banners, homemade placards, the rest of it, and just be really present.
It's true.
And the friendships and comradeships that were formed were tremendous. It's very interesting that even today, people still, from 30 years ago, more than 30 years ago, and people are still pleased to see each other because of what they'd done all that time ago.
Christabel, I've known you since I was a little girl. My parents were friends with you from the 60s in Notting Hill. And, you've always been part of that sort of political landscape. So these things are really they stay with you.
They definitely do. I would say I've got friends that I have been friends with since then and will be friends with forever. And there are quite a lot, actually. And there are also people who I didn't know were active then, but it forms a connection. If they say they were active, you think, oh, actually, that's an immediate connection. With the momentum towards change in South Africa, Christabel, you maybe to start with, as you were editing at the time Anti-Apartheid News, were you expecting the change that came?
No, I don't think we were. I think for a lot of us, anti-apartheid became a way of life. And the strange thing now is that we weren't dismayed or put off by that. It was just something you went on doing. And actually, when Mandela was released, there was great joy. And it did seem like the beginning of the end. But it was a problem for the anti-apartheid movement because a lot of people thought it was all over. And the anti-apartheid movement very much didn't think it was all over because we didn't believe that de Klerk was going to willingly give up power. We thought there would be some sort of compromise brokered by Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan that would be very, very much short of a genuine democratic country run by the majority of its people. And so it was a kind of double-edged situation.
It's an interesting question, Lela, because on the one hand, the figurehead of Mandela was really important and became increasingly so. But as you say, with his release, people didn't really think about, hang on a second, what has been lost and what has been gained in this process? And the economic ties that still very much South Africa was dependent upon, and the kind of, as you say, the kind of deals that were being struck and degrees of compromise. It was very, very difficult. So on the one hand, it was fantastic to have Mandela free and his comrades. But in other ways, it became a different kind of campaign because people were thinking, oh, this figurehead, this wonderful man, this saint. So it was very exciting to have all these protests and all these bands playing and you know, the whole world watching. That was wonderful. But what was really going on a political level in terms of the leadership and some still very reactionary Western leaders involved, that was the kind of the darker side that I think people needed to kind of get their heads around. And there was a lot of momentum. I certainly at Mandela Street and, you know, all this, oh, we're doing this concert and we're doing this campaign and we're outside the embassy. All of those things were wonderful and the marches. But there was a sense of, okay, well, how will this all translate and in terms of on the ground in South Africa?
I wonder whether that was something that ordinary everyday people were conscious of. I recall just feeling elation, just rushing to Trafalgar. It was like the best thing that could ever have happened. And at that moment, I didn't worry about what the underground media was. It was quite a while later that I realised that the release of Mandela was the beginning and not the end. For me, some of that realisation was about the condition of black people, not just in South Africa, but across the world, and realising that there's a lot of stuff that has not changed for the ordinary, everyday black person. So I think there are lots of levels at which there was reaction. I don't know whether from your circles, what the reactions were for people who were less involved, perhaps.
I think, Lela, the problem was the people who were less involved thought that it was all over.
Yeah.
I think people really did feel that. And also that was partly because Mandela had been so built up as the central figure. And so it was very hard. The anti-apartheid movement couldn't raise money after 1990 to carry on.
I think there was also, it's interesting, I mean, this was the strange kind of dichotomy. I remember being at the second concert at Wembley when Mandela was free and he was able to be there as well. So we'd had the first one when we were launching the campaign to free Mandela at 70, which is all full of excitement and anticipation. And it was wonderful when he was there and everybody was there. But I remember being so disheartened by a group of young people, just a small group who were there at the concert, and there was a kind of a short lull between bands. And one of them was asking her friend, a girl was asking her friend, this guy, well, you know, what did he do? And he went, well, he was a terrorist, wasn't he? And I thought, oh, wow. I just looked at him and I said, do you really know the history of why we're here. And he was very dismissive. I mean, he wasn't aggressive, but I thought, wow, he can come to a concert. You can be so excited by something and still the whole thing is, you've missed it. And I think that's quite indicative of, on many levels, the racism that people were still experiencing, the ignorance that people had. And sometimes you can be in a kind of cocoon of the people who are progressive and think like you and want to fight. Certainly at school and college and on the streets, London was still a very racist place as well. Certainly it was extremely so in South Africa in terms of people's thinking. And so we were in pockets of security when we were amongst our comrades, but certainly in my experience on the streets in London, as I say, there was racism was still rife and there was still a lot of ignorance. And I think some of the people got involved because they were excited about something happening. It's a bit like Live Aid. They got very excited, but why was there poverty? So there were lots of campaigns and lots of issues that were about political structural inequalities. And sometimes people they jumped on the bandwagon at the excitement of it all and the thrills and the glitter of it all, but not necessarily really getting underneath. And so, I think there was still a lot of work to do there.
What were your feelings, Christabel, at that time and potentially subsequently?
My initial personal feeling was, now I can go and campaign on something else. And I wanted to go and campaign on eco issues, and particularly at the time, the big news item was the Newbury bypass. And I thought I will become an eco campaigner and I will campaign against roads. And I went on a demo to Newbury, which was great. We walked through the woods. But then I realised that the nitty-gritty of campaigning against roads, do you remember Swampy, Lela and Nadia? Swampy Borough was tunnelled into the ground where the Newbury bypass was going to be built and wouldn't come out, and other people were in the trees. And I thought, actually, however strongly I feel about this is not for me. And so that didn't quite work out. And then we formed the Anti-Apartheid Movement. The core people who are still involved, as you'll both remember, didn't want to give up and formed a new organisation, Action for Southern Africa, to do precisely what Lela is talking about, to try to support the new South Africa and the other newly liberated countries of Southern Africa in overcoming the huge legacy of apartheid. And so I did become involved then in ACSA, which extraordinarily and wonderfully, in a way, as a small organisation, still exists.
Yes, absolutely. And I think certainly for me, that was why I got involved and stayed involved with ACSA for so long, was that thing of the underlying structural issues have not shifted significantly. And I remember one of the ACSA's posters was "Let South Africa Reap the Fruits of Freedom." And it was all about trade, for example, trade justice, which exists. Nadia, what were your sort of thoughts about the victory and the wider...
The victory, I mean, when I was young, all we ever heard was my parents, would they be able to go home at any point? Would they be able to go home? So finally they could go home and be there with their family and comrades, and never expected to be here this long. I mean, it was, a long time. They came here as relatively young people. So that was a wonderful thing. I mean, it was fantastic and we were all thrilled. And only really after did people start to think what price was paid for that victory. There had been lots of concerns about how things would develop after, and there were lots of things that were complex. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the development of the country, universal franchise. There were complexities to how people would be able to become active citizens and, raise the kind of fairness and distribution across the country. There were issues that concerned everybody, and it was a big thing. We were so keen to kind of get apartheid to an end, but the actual development, the long-term development and the complexities of that, power struggles was another matter altogether.
Looking back now, I realise that the anti-apartheid movement actually changed my life in quite a fundamental way and has kind of shaped what I've done. And to even what I do now in terms of being a director of Black Thrive in the UK, the victory created a belief and a knowledge, embodied knowledge in me that change is possible. And that's what I feel has changed my life. That embodied knowledge that change is possible. So regardless of what the issues and challenges have been. The fact that there was a fight for something that we won, and that it wasn't an accident. It was hard-fought, led by African and Asian South Africans, who we took the lead from. So the model of taking the lead from the people, ordinary people of the country who were fighting for their freedom, supporting them in a very structured and organised way, and a way that was fun as well, to be honest, because I don't think I'm not sure at my age then, early 20s, that I'd have stuck with it if it hadn't been fun, actually. To take that and to follow it through and be disciplined in landing something. And it was systematic. So for me, that was like, it just changed the whole way I think about what's possible. So even till today, people talk about racism in Britain, which is still present. There's been quite a bit of progress on a number of fronts. Disablism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, everything. But what I know is it doesn't have to be that way. And I know that from the bottom of my heart because of the anti-apartheid movement. And I'm not sure whether I'd have known that. And that knowledge changes how I behave and what I aspire to do. That knowledge that change is possible.
Lela Kogbara, Nadia Joseph and Christabel Gurney on their long campaign to bring a measure of justice to a divided world. Many thanks to all three of them for sharing their experiences. Next time on Activism in the 80s, we meet female theatre professionals who faced a glass ceiling made of stone.
I remember when everything from going to see the accountants to the lawyers to anybody else, we were kind of treated as girls who needed a bit of fatherly help and advice.
Thanks for watching. See you in the next episode.